When an avoidant partner pulls away, the first instinct most people have is to interpret that distance as rejection. The silence feels personal, the lack of contact feels like indifference, and the mind immediately begins constructing a story. If they truly cared, they wouldn't leave. But psychology tells us something far more complex is happening beneath the surface. For individuals with avoidant attachment patterns, emotional closeness can activate a very specific internal alarm system. Intimacy represents vulnerability, and vulnerability represents risk. Not necessarily the risk of being hurt by you, but the risk of losing control over their own emotional equilibrium. So when feelings begin to deepen, the avoidant mind often responds the only way it has learned to protect itself. It creates space. From the outside, that space looks like withdrawal. It looks like detachment. It looks like someone shutting the door on a connection that once felt powerful. But distance in these situations serves a very different psychological function. Distance creates clarity. When two people are constantly interacting, texting, calling, seeing each other, the emotional signal is mixed with noise. There are expectations, pressures, misunderstandings, and the everyday friction of human interaction. The avoidant nervous system becomes overwhelmed by that constant input, and so the mind does what it has been conditioned to do. It reduces stimulation. But here is the paradox most people don't understand. When someone creates distance from you, they remove the external pressure of the relationship, but they cannot remove the internal imprint of the connection. The conversations you shared, the emotional safety they unexpectedly felt with you, the moments where they briefly allowed themselves to be seen. Those experiences don't disappear simply because communication stops. In fact, something interesting happens during the silence. Without the immediate pressure of intimacy, the avoidant mind begins to process the relationship in a calmer psychological environment. The defensive walls that were activated during closeness slowly relax. And this is often the first time they can actually feel the significance of the connection. Not because you are reminding them, not because you are pursuing them, but because the absence allows the mind to examine what was real. Think about it like standing too close to a painting. When your face is inches away from the canvas, all you can see are random brushstrokes. It looks chaotic. It doesn't make sense. But when you step back, the image becomes visible. Distance creates perspective. The same principle applies to human relationships. If a connection is superficial, distance erases it. People move on quickly because there was never much emotional depth there to begin with. But when the bond carried genuine meaning, when there was emotional resonance, intellectual connection, and a sense of psychological recognition, distance often does the opposite. It reveals the weight of what was shared. This doesn't mean the avoidant suddenly becomes expressive or openly emotional. That's not typically how their personality structure works. Their realization is usually quiet, internal, almost philosophical. They begin to recognize that the connection they stepped away from was not easily replaceable. And this is why, in many relationships like this, the story doesn't actually end when the distance begins. The distance becomes the beginning of understanding. Because if two people truly have a meaningful connection, space doesn't destroy it. It exposes it. And sometimes the clearest proof that a bond mattered is the realization that even in silence, it never fully disappeared. Once you begin to understand how distance reveals the truth of a connection, the next pattern becomes easier to recognize. And it's a pattern that confuses many people because it doesn't look like a normal relationship path. Instead of steady progress, the connection moves in cycles. Closeness, distance, reconnection, and then distance again. To someone on the outside, it can look chaotic. It can even look unhealthy. People might say, "Why do you keep going back?" Or, if it were meant to work, it would be easy. But human psychology is rarely that simple. When you're dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies, intimacy doesn't just bring comfort. It also activates deeply conditioned fears. Fears that often formed long before you ever entered the picture. These fears revolve around autonomy, emotional exposure, and the possibility of dependency. For the avoidant mind, closeness can feel like standing at the edge of something powerful but unpredictable. Part of them wants connection. Another part of them is wired to maintain distance. So the relationship moves like a tide. There are moments when the connection flows inward, when conversations deepen, when vulnerability appears, when both people feel a genuine emotional bond forming. In those moments, the relationship can feel effortless and profound. It's the phase where both people think, This could really become something. But just as that closeness begins to stabilize, another internal signal often activates inside the avoidant partner. The mind begins to interpret emotional dependency as a threat to independence, and so the tide pulls back. Distance appears again. Now here's the key insight most people miss. These cycles are not always signs of failure. In many cases, they are signs that two people are interacting with unresolved psychological patterns that are slowly being exposed. Each cycle reveals something. The first time distance happens, the non-avoidant partner often reacts with confusion or anxiety. They try harder. They reach out more. They attempt to fix what they believe went wrong. But eventually, if growth begins to occur, the response changes. Instead of chasing, they start developing emotional boundaries. They begin focusing on their own stability rather than trying to control the relationship's outcome. At the same time, the avoidant partner is going through their own internal process. Each cycle forces them to confront a contradiction. They want connection, yet their instinct pushes them to escape it. Over time, that contradiction becomes harder to ignore. Because every time they pull away, they eventually notice something. The connection they stepped away from still holds meaning. And that realization slowly reshapes their understanding of intimacy. Psychological growth rarely happens through comfort alone. It happens through friction, the moments where our patterns stop working the way they used to. So these cycles, as exhausting as they can feel, sometimes act like mirrors. They show both people the parts of themselves that need to evolve. The anxious partner learns self-respect and emotional independence. The avoidant partner learns that closeness does not automatically erase autonomy. And when those lessons begin to integrate, something remarkable happens. The cycles start to slow down, not because one person finally won the emotional battle, but because both individuals have grown enough to approach the relationship differently. What once felt like a push and pull dynamic gradually becomes something more stable. And that's when you realize something important about connections that are truly transformative. They rarely arrive in perfect form. They evolve through pressure, awareness, and personal growth. Because sometimes the very cycles that seem like the relationship's greatest weakness are actually the process through which two people become capable of sustaining it. After experiencing those repeated cycles of closeness and distance, something important eventually begins to shift, but not where most people expect it. Many assume the turning point happens when the avoidant partner suddenly changes, when they finally become expressive, consistent, or emotionally open. But in reality, the true turning point often begins somewhere else entirely. It begins when the other person stops chasing. Now, this is not about playing games, and it's not about manipulation. It's about a deeper psychological transformation that happens when someone reclaims their emotional independence. When you're caught in a push-pull dynamic with an avoidant partner, it's very easy to become focused entirely on the relationship. Every silence feels like a signal you must decode. Every delayed message becomes a source of analysis. Your emotional state begins to rise and fall based on their behavior. And without realizing it, your sense of stability becomes tied to their responses. But something powerful happens when that pattern breaks. Instead of constantly trying to repair the connection, you redirect that energy inward. You rebuild your own center of gravity. You invest time into your growth, your work, your friendships, your purpose. You stop structuring your life around whether the avoidant partner is moving closer or farther away. From a psychological perspective, this creates a completely different dynamic. Avoidant personalities are highly sensitive to perceived pressure. The moment they feel someone is trying to control the pace of intimacy, whether through emotional demands, constant reassurance seeking, or persistent pursuit, their instinct is to retreat further, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system interprets pressure as a loss of autonomy. When you remove that pressure, something unexpected happens. The emotional environment becomes safer. There is no longer a sense that the relationship is an obligation they must constantly manage. Instead, the connection becomes something they can approach voluntarily, without feeling that their independence is being threatened. And ironically, that freedom often sparks curiosity. When someone who once seemed intensely focused on the relationship suddenly becomes grounded in their own life, the avoidant mind notices. They begin to sense that the dynamic has changed. You're no longer orbiting around them. You've become centered in your own world, and that shift carries a very specific psychological signal: stability. Stability is deeply attractive to avoidant personalities because it removes the chaos they often fear in relationships. When they see someone who is emotionally secure, someone who isn't chasing, demanding, or collapsing under uncertainty, it begins to challenge their assumptions about intimacy. They start to see the relationship not as something that will trap them, but as something that could exist alongside their independence. Now, this doesn't mean they immediately come running back with declarations of love. Avoidant personalities tend to move slowly, often processing their emotions internally rather than expressing them openly. But the energy between you has changed. Instead of a dynamic where one person pursues and the other escapes, a new balance begins to form. Two individuals standing on their own emotional ground. And in that space, something much healthier becomes possible. Because real connection doesn't come from dependence. It comes from two people who are capable of standing alone, but choose, consciously, to move closer together. When you stop chasing validation and start living from your own center, you send a message that goes far beyond words. You show that your value is not defined by someone else's availability. And paradoxically, that is often the moment when the avoidant partner begins to see you and the connection in an entirely new light. Because the strongest relationships are not built when one person clings and the other runs. They are built when both people learn how to stand firmly on their own and then decide that the connection is worth walking back toward. Once emotional independence begins to take shape, something subtle but powerful starts happening on the other side of the connection. The avoidant partner, who once seemed distant, detached, or indifferent, enters a phase that most people never see. They begin to reevaluate the connection. Now, this process rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Avoidant personalities are not usually expressive processors. They don't always talk openly about what they're feeling, and they certainly don't rush to announce their realizations. Their processing tends to be quiet, internal, reflective. But internally, something important begins unfolding. When the pressure of the relationship disappears, when they no longer feel chased or emotionally cornered, their mind finally has the space to examine the connection without defensiveness. And that's when memory begins to work in a very interesting way. They start replaying moments, not the conflicts or the misunderstandings that once justified their withdrawal, but the moments that felt genuine, the conversations that flowed naturally, the times when they felt unexpectedly understood, the small details that once felt easy to overlook. Human beings are wired to remember emotional safety. Even people who struggle with closeness carry a deep awareness of when they felt truly seen. And when the relationship is no longer immediately present, those memories often become clearer. This is where a deeper psychological realization sometimes begins to form. Avoidant individuals often believe that distance will simplify their emotional world. The assumption is that by stepping away from the connection, the intensity of those feelings will fade and life will return to a more manageable rhythm. But occasionally, the opposite happens. Instead of fading, the emotional imprint remains. They may meet other people, return to their routines, or fill their time with work and distractions. Yet something about the previous connection continues to stand out in their memory. It had a different quality. Maybe it was the depth of the conversations. Maybe it was the sense of intellectual compatibility. Maybe it was the rare experience of feeling accepted without needing to perform or prove anything. Whatever the reason, the mind begins comparing. And comparison is powerful because when someone realizes that a connection was rare, it changes the way they interpret their past decision to walk away. They begin to ask questions they weren't ready to ask before. Was the distance really about the other person? Or was it about my own fear of closeness? Was the relationship actually unstable? Or did I withdraw because I didn't know how to stay present when things became emotionally real? These questions don't always produce immediate answers, but they create awareness. And awareness is where growth begins. Now, it's important to understand that this reevaluation doesn't mean the avoidant suddenly becomes a different person overnight. Psychological patterns that formed over years or even decades don't dissolve instantly, but the narrative inside their mind begins to shift. Instead of seeing the relationship as something they escaped, they begin seeing it as something they may have misunderstood. And that realization can quietly reshape their perception of the connection. Because when someone recognizes that a bond carried genuine depth, it becomes much harder to dismiss it as just another passing experience. They begin to understand that what they felt was not ordinary. And when that awareness settles in, it changes the way they look at the possibility of reconnecting. Not from a place of impulse or loneliness, but from a place of reflection. Because sometimes the mind needs distance to recognize value. And sometimes the quiet realization that a connection was rare becomes the very reason someone begins finding their way back toward it. The truth is simple but profound. People often understand the importance of a connection only after they've had the space to see it clearly. When a connection has moved through distance, reflection, and personal growth, there is a moment that sometimes arrives quietly but powerfully, the possibility of reunion. But when two people reconnect after this kind of psychological journey, it rarely looks the way it did the first time. And this is important to understand. Most people imagine reunion as a dramatic return. They picture emotional confessions, long conversations about what went wrong, and an immediate restoration of what once existed. But real reconnections, especially with someone who has avoidant tendencies, usually unfold very differently. They tend to be subtle. Instead of a grand emotional declaration, the reconnection might begin with something small, a simple message, a brief conversation, a moment of curiosity that slowly opens the door again. And the tone feels different. The urgency that once defined the relationship is gone. The emotional pressure that once triggered defensive reactions has softened. Both people have lived through the distance, and that experience has changed them in ways they may not even fully realize yet. This is where the earlier growth becomes incredibly important. The person who once felt compelled to chase or seek constant reassurance has learned something valuable. Their stability doesn't depend on the relationship. They've rebuilt a life that stands on its own foundation. That quiet confidence changes the energy of the interaction. At the same time, the avoidant partner has likely gone through their own internal evolution. Through distance and reflection, they've had the opportunity to recognize that closeness doesn't automatically mean losing their independence. They may still move carefully. They may still value personal space, but there is often a greater awareness of what the connection meant and what it could become if approached differently. So when the two people meet again, the dynamic is no longer built on pursuit and retreat. Instead, it becomes something far more balanced. Conversations feel calmer. Expectations feel clearer. There is less need to force emotional intensity because both individuals have learned that genuine connection grows through consistency rather than urgency. This is where something interesting begins to happen. The relationship starts to rebuild itself on a new psychological foundation. In the past, the bond may have been driven largely by attraction, chemistry, and emotional intensity. Those elements created a powerful spark, but they also triggered fears and insecurities that neither person fully understood at the time. Now the connection has the opportunity to evolve into something more stable. There is more patience, more self-awareness, more respect for each other's boundaries, and perhaps most importantly, there is a deeper understanding of what the relationship actually requires to survive. Because when two people reconnect after genuine personal growth, they are no longer trying to recreate the past. They are building something new, something that incorporates everything they've learned through the distance, the silence, and the reflection. And that difference matters. The first version of the relationship may have been fueled by emotion, but the second version has the potential to be guided by wisdom. Both people now understand the fragile balance between closeness and independence. They recognize the patterns that once pulled them apart, and they approach the connection with a greater sense of responsibility for how they show up. And when that awareness is present, the relationship no longer feels like a cycle. It begins to feel like progress, because the strongest connections are not the ones that never break. They are the ones where two people grow enough, individually, to come back and build something stronger than what existed before. And when a reunion happens from that place of maturity and clarity, it stops being about rekindling the past. It becomes about consciously creating a future that neither person was ready for the first time around. As we reach the final idea in this journey, it's important to clarify something that people often misunderstand when they talk about being destined to be with someone. Most people imagine destiny as something mystical. Something that guarantees two people will always find their way back to each other no matter what happens. Almost like the universe is forcing the relationship into existence. But psychologically, destiny doesn't really work that way. Destiny is not about inevitability. It's about alignment. Two people can feel an incredibly powerful connection and still fail to build a lasting relationship if they are not emotionally prepared for it. Timing matters. Self-awareness matters. Emotional maturity matters. And sometimes the reason a connection falls apart the first time is not because it lacked meaning, but because the two individuals had not yet developed the capacity to sustain it. Think about what we've explored throughout this entire discussion. At first there was attraction and closeness, followed by distance, then cycles of separation and return. Eventually, there was a shift toward emotional independence. After that came reflection and reevaluation. And finally, the possibility of reconnection built on growth rather than urgency. None of those stages are random. They are part of a psychological process. Each phase forces both individuals to confront something within themselves. For one person, it might be the fear of abandonment or the tendency to seek validation. For the other, it might be the fear of intimacy or the instinct to escape emotional vulnerability. These patterns often develop long before the relationship begins. They are shaped by past experiences, childhood environments, and years of learned behavior. So when two people with these patterns meet, the relationship becomes more than just romance. It becomes a catalyst for self-awareness. And this is where the deeper meaning of destiny begins to appear. Destiny is not simply about meeting the right person. It's about becoming the version of yourself who can actually maintain the connection once you've found it. Without that growth, even the most powerful bond can collapse under the weight of old habits and unconscious fears. But when both people evolve, when they develop emotional stability, clearer boundaries, and a better understanding of their own psychological patterns, something remarkable begins to happen. The connection that once felt turbulent starts to stabilize. The push and pull dynamic fades, not because the attraction disappeared, but because the individuals themselves have changed. The avoidant partner learns that intimacy does not mean losing independence. The other partner learns that love cannot be built through pursuit or control. And when those lessons settle into place, both people begin approaching the relationship from a new perspective. Not from fear, not from desperation, but from choice. That is the moment when alignment appears. Two individuals who once triggered each other's insecurities now recognize each other's growth. They see the connection clearly, without the distortions created by anxiety or avoidance. And the relationship becomes something far more grounded than it was before. It is no longer driven by emotional chaos. It is sustained by awareness. So when people say that two individuals were destined to be together, what they are often describing is not fate forcing them into each other's lives. They are describing the moment when two separate journeys of growth finally arrive at the same place. A place where both people are capable of giving and receiving the connection they once struggled to hold. Because in the end, the most powerful relationships are not the ones that survive because of destiny. They are the ones that endure because two people grew enough to finally meet each other at the same emotional level. And when that alignment happens, the connection no longer feels like a struggle. It feels like recognition. As we bring this full circle, here's the truth. Relationships with avoidant partners are not simple, and they are never linear. They test your patience, your self-awareness, and your emotional strength. The cycles of distance, reflection, and reconnection aren't failures. They are the very mechanisms through which growth occurs. If you are destined to be with someone who has avoidant tendencies, the connection will challenge you, but it will also reveal profound truths about yourself and the bond you share. You will learn the power of emotional independence, the importance of reflection, and the necessity of boundaries. You will see that closeness does not require chasing, and that love is not about control, but about alignment. Ultimately, being destined is not about fate forcing you together. It's about both people evolving to the point where they can meet each other fully, consciously, and intentionally. It's about becoming the version of yourself who can sustain the connection and recognizing when the other person has done the same. So if you felt the cycles, the distance, the push and pull, know this. The journey itself is the preparation. The struggles, the silence, the moments of